Amara Johnson had always known she was different. Not in the awkward, adolescent way that makes a child feel lost, but in the way that elders whisper with reverence. Her skin, the color of onyx kissed by midnight, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In her neighborhood in Atlanta, she stood out for the kind of beauty that made strangers pause, eyes lingering for a heartbeat longer than usual. Too beautiful to go unnoticed, her grandmother used to say, brushing a proud hand through her thick coils of natural hair. But as Amara grew older, that reverence transformed into a complicated silence. Praise at home turned to rejection in the world she most wanted to enter. She had always dreamed of being a model. From the age of 8, she would stand before her mirror and imitate runway poses she memorized from fashion magazines her mother brought home from the corner store. She had the stride, the cheekbones, the posture. What she didn't have, apparently, was the right shade of skin. At 22, Amara had finally saved enough to take a trip to New York City. Portfolio in hand, heart full of dreams. Her photos, taken by a friend in her community with natural talent for capturing light and shadow, showed her range, from high fashion to commercial warmth. She entered agency after agency, always walking in with poise and hope. But one by one, the doors shut. The feedback was always vague at first. You got a strong look. You photograph well, but we're not sure how to place you. One agent, a woman in her 40s with glossy smile, flipped through her portfolio with practiced coldness, then set it down gently as if it might break. There's just not a current demand for your aesthetic, she said. We're looking for a more versatile appeal. The worst came on a rainy afternoon when she met with a prominent agency in Manhattan. She was ushered into a sleek white room that smelled of eucalyptus and money. The casting director, a tall man in designer glasses, took one look at her and said, "You're too dark for the kind of campaigns we're casting right now. It's a tough market." Too dark. The words lodged in her chest like a shard of glass. She nodded, thanked him, and left the building without saying much else. As the rain pelted down, she didn't even open her umbrella. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Her dream, once vibrant and stubborn, now felt childish. She walked 10 blocks before realizing her feet were soaked. Back in Atlanta, her silence became a routine. She rarely left her room, declining dinner invites, ignoring calls from friends who had rooted for her since day one. Her mother knocked softly each night, never pressing too hard. Amara didn't cry, at least not in front of anyone. She wasn't angry either. She was hollowed out, confused by the contradiction. How could the world celebrate diversity and still find a way to erase her? One night, the silence turned loud. It was just past midnight when she sat in front of her mirror again. Her skin, radiant even under the dull glow of a desk lamp, stared back. She picked up her phone. No makeup, no ring light, no pose, just her face, bare and unwavering. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she thought of what to write. She thought of every little girl who looked like her, who might one day walk into a room and be told she was too much, too dark, too something. She thought of herself at 8 years old, practicing poses in her bedroom, believing there was space for her in a world that didn't want to see her. And then, without much more thought, she typed, "Too dark to model? Watch me." She hit post. The moment felt small, quiet. There were no fireworks. She didn't expect anything to happen. It was just a release, an act of defiance not meant for virality but survival. She turned off her phone and fell asleep, not knowing that her life had already begun to change. By morning, everything was different. Her phone was overheating with notifications. Thousands of likes, shares, comments. Messages from people around the world, Nigeria, Brazil, the UK, South Africa, all pouring in. Some were angry on her behalf. Others overwhelmed by her beauty. Others still telling their own stories of rejection and silence. Celebrities began sharing her post. Activists tagged fashion brands. Influencers wrote long captions about colorism, beauty standards, and the absurdity of her exclusion. And somewhere in Los Angeles, in a bright loft lined with black and white portraits, a woman named Sierra Bloom scrolled past Amara's photo, stopped and stared. Known for her work on raw, emotionally charged campaigns, Sierra rarely reacted publicly. But that morning, she not only shared the post, she messaged Amara directly. "I need you in my studio. Today, please don't say no." The message sat in Amara's inbox as she stared at the screen, heart racing, unsure if it was even real. For the first time in days, she left her bed. The silence that had wrapped around her like a shroud began to crack. Something had been set in motion. Something big. And all it took was a single post. A face. A truth. And 3 defiant words. Too dark to model? Watch me. Amara didn't leave her room for hours after reading the message from Sierra Bloom. She stared at the screen as if the text might disappear, as if it were some digital hallucination conjured by hope. She knew Sierra's name, of course. Anyone remotely interested in fashion did. Sierra Bloom wasn't just a photographer. She was a cultural force, someone who turned campaigns into social commentaries and unknown faces into icons. Her signature was authenticity, her style unapologetically raw. And she wanted Amara. Today, the thought both thrilled and terrified her. The sudden exposure from a viral post had shaken her in ways she didn't yet understand. She had gone to bed as someone discarded, overlooked, cast aside, and woke up to find herself at the center of a conversation she hadn't asked to lead. People were debating her face, her skin, her place in an industry that had never made space for her. Some messages came with love. Others were sharp with sarcasm or veiled hostility. But Sierra's message was something else. It was an invitation. Amara took a deep breath and typed a reply. Where and when? She didn't even tell her mother. There was something sacred about this moment. Fragile, like a bird in the hand. And she didn't want to jinx it by saying it out loud. She packed a small bag, called a car, and flew to Los Angeles that same evening. The whole trip felt surreal. Every person who glanced her way at the airport, every scrolling passenger glued to their phones, it all made her hyper-aware that her face, her words, were now out in the world being seen, interpreted, debated. The next morning, she arrived at Sierra's studio. It wasn't housed in a sleek, sterile building like the agencies in New York had been. It was warm, chaotic, bursting with color and movement. Walls were covered in prints of every size. Portraits of women, mostly, of all ages and tones, captured in unflinching detail. Sierra herself was in the middle of a shoot when Amara arrived. She wore denim overalls and no shoes, her red curls tied back messily, camera slung around her neck like a permanent accessory. She spotted Amara and waved her in without hesitation. "You're even more striking in person," she said, walking over with a kind of confident ease that disarmed Amara instantly. "I'm not here to fix you, pose you, or retouch you. I'm here to show you." Amara didn't know what to say. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her without trying to edit her, literally or metaphorically. The shoot began almost immediately. There was no glam squad, no bright lights, no backdrops, just a chair by a tall window, the light of mid-morning pouring in. Sierra gave no elaborate direction. She simply told Amara to sit, look into the lens, and exist. The camera clicked, and clicked, and clicked. With each frame, Amara felt layers peeling off. Layers of doubt, of rejection, of trying to fit into boxes built without her in mind. Sierra asked questions between shots. What's your first memory of being called beautiful? When did you start thinking your skin was a problem? What would you say to the little girl version of yourself right now? Amara answered them all, not with rehearsed eloquence, but with quiet truths. Her voice shook, then steadied. By the end of the session, tears welled in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from a kind of release she didn't know she needed. She was exhausted and reborn. Sierra didn't say much as they reviewed the photos together later that afternoon. She let the images speak for themselves. Each one captured Amara in stark, luminous clarity. No filters, no shadows to soften her edges. Just truth. Sierra pointed to one photo, her favorite. Amara's gaze, and it was unflinching. Her expression unreadable yet magnetic. "This," Sierra said, tapping the image. "This isn't just a portrait. It's a challenge. It asks a question we've been too afraid to answer." Amara looked at the photo. She didn't see a model. She saw herself. Raw, real, powerful. That same evening, Sierra made an announcement on her social media accounts. The project, she explained, will be called Face of the Unseen. It wasn't a campaign for a brand or a magazine. It was a personal project, self-funded, created to force an industry and a public to confront what it had long ignored. Within 24 hours, the first billboards went up in downtown Los Angeles. Amara's face, larger than life, gazed out over freeways and shopping districts. The chosen photo bore a single caption, "Too dark or too powerful to ignore." Passers-by stopped to stare. Some took photos. Some frowned. Some smiled. The image was everywhere, on buses, on the sides of buildings and subway stations. It spread not just in physical spaces, but online. Within days, media outlets picked up the story. Comment sections lit up. Interviews were requested. Discussions broke out on news panels. Aesthetic or activism, representation or agenda. Amara tried to keep her balance as the whirlwind intensified. She had only taken a photo, told a truth, but somehow it had become a reckoning. She stood in front of one of the billboards on her second day in Los Angeles, looking up at her own face. Strangers passed by, some recognizing her, others oblivious. A child pointed and whispered something to her mother. A teenager nearby looked at Amara, then back at the billboard, and simply said, "Finally!" Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had never wanted a revolution. She had wanted visibility, dignity, a seat at the table. And now, her presence alone had kicked the table over, and it had only just begun. By the end of the week, the city had become an unintended gallery, and Amara Johnson its unlikely centerpiece. The campaign that Sierra Bloom had birthed in her studio had spread faster than either of them expected. It started with the billboards downtown, then moved outward through South Central, Silver Lake, Hollywood, and eventually into the affluent enclaves of Beverly Hills and Westwood. Each location bore the same question: too dark or too powerful to ignore? And Amara's face, printed with such clarity it felt alive, stared back with unyielding stillness. Amara remained in Los Angeles longer than she had planned, pulled into a vortex of unexpected momentum. Sierra put her up in a guest loft connected to the studio, a quiet space filled with light and books, and a small balcony that overlooked a courtyard garden. Each morning she woke to dozens of new messages, interview requests, brand inquiries, and strangers recounting how her image had impacted them. It was overwhelming, and yet somehow grounding. The silence that had once filled her after rejection was gone, replaced not by noise, but by the gravity of having been seen. Really seen. Still, Amara wasn't sure what to do with the attention. She hadn't asked for a spotlight. She had posted a photo out of defiance, not strategy. And yet now, she was here, embroiled in something that felt much larger than her. Sierra tried to shield her from the worst of it. Her team filtered press inquiries and declined anything that felt opportunistic or tone-deaf. But there were limits to how much protection could be offered when an image went viral in the way Amara's had. Brands began reaching out. Not the small indie labels who usually hunger for edge and novelty, but massive corporations that had built empires on mainstream appeal. There was talk of partnerships, campaigns, even licensing deals. Some offers came with enthusiastic language about diversity efforts and reimagining beauty standards, but Amara could read the subtext. Most of them were reacting to the public's interest, not leading it. They saw her not as a revelation, but as a reaction. One morning, Amara and Sierra met in the studio's editing room to review footage for a short documentary that Sierra's assistant had been filming throughout the process. They sat in silence as a clip played of Amara standing in front of one of the billboards, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on her own image. In the background, two teenagers debated loudly. "She's so pretty," one said. "Like, real pretty?" "Yeah," the other replied. "But I don't know. It's just a lot. Like, do we have to make everything about race now?" Sierra paused the footage. "You want to use that clip?" Amara asked, turning to her. "I do," Sierra said, "because it's real, and it shows how uncomfortable some people still are with visibility that doesn't cater to them." Amara nodded slowly. She wasn't offended by the exchange. She had heard worse. But the comment echoed something she had sensed brewing online. Not all the responses to the campaign had been celebratory. Some were sharply critical, accusing it of being an exaggerated statement or aesthetic activism. Others framed it as unnecessary, suggesting that racism in modeling was overstated or outdated. One particularly viral post read, "If you're beautiful, you'll get booked. Skin tone has nothing to do with it. Stop making everything political." It stung, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. That subtle, coded way of saying, if you're not where you want to be, maybe you're just not good enough. Amara didn't respond publicly to the backlash, but it simmered inside her. Not anger, exactly, more like a quiet, simmering fire, a reminder that her presence in those spaces wasn't just a disruption. It was a threat to the illusion that the system had ever been fair. To cope, she threw herself into the next shoot Sierra planned. It was more elaborate this time. Sierra had rented a converted warehouse in the Arts District. Exposed brick, high ceilings, soft natural light streaming through skylights. But again, the vision was stripped down. No stylists, no artificial perfection. Just a chair, a mirror, and a camera. The concept was simple. Amara would be photographed while watching herself. A mirror placed just off-frame would reflect her image back as she posed, and Sierra would capture the unfiltered reaction. The effect was startling. As the shoot progressed, Amara's expression shifted, not in performance, but in reflection. There were moments of pride, doubt, sorrow, joy. At one point, she laughed. At another, she looked close to tears. Sierra didn't stop the session. She kept shooting, silently, moving around the space like a dancer, never interrupting the flow. When it was over, Amara sat back, drained and contemplative. "I didn't realize how much of me I hadn't looked at until today," she said. Sierra nodded, gently placing the camera down. "That's the point. This isn't about how others see you. It's about how you see yourself, and whether you believe it's enough." Later that evening, Sierra sent Amara a series of selects from the shoot. They were haunting, vulnerable, intimate. Unlike the previous campaign, these images would not go on billboards. They were being saved for an exhibition Sierra was planning, one that would travel to several cities, framed by conversations and community panels about representation, erasure, and the violence of invisibility. As news of the exhibition leaked, interest grew. Institutions reached out to host it. Universities invited Amara to speak. Publicists began circling. Suddenly, her calendar was filling with things she never imagined: guest lectures, fashion editorials, roundtable discussions. But she wasn't a media-trained activist or polished spokesperson. She was just a woman who had dared to show up fully, and the world hadn't known what to do with it. One night, sitting alone on the balcony of the studio loft, she scrolled through her old photos, one she had once submitted to agencies and had been dismissed without a second glance. She paused on one particular image, a black and white portrait, sharp jawline, eyes lifted toward the light. It was a good photo, a strong one, and yet it had never been enough. She thought about all the doors that had been closed to her, all the words never said out loud but implied in tone, in silence, in rejection. And now, because one door had opened, just one, everything had changed, not just for her, but maybe, just maybe, for someone watching. She leaned back, took a slow breath, and said softly to herself, "Let them see everything they tried not to." Within a month, Amara's life had become a balancing act between overwhelming visibility and the quiet ache of responsibility. Her image had sparked a national conversation, one that reached beyond fashion and into the undercurrents of race, beauty, and what the industry dared call marketable. The exhibition, launched in Los Angeles and scheduled to travel to Chicago, New York, and Atlanta, was already drawing crowds and panel discussions. Magazine spreads featured her face with captions that used words like trailblazer, symbol, and movement. But none of those labels sat easily with her. In interviews, Amara often hesitated when asked about her role in shifting the cultural dialogue. Her voice remained composed, but her answers were measured. The truth was, she didn't feel like a revolutionary. She felt like someone who had spent most of her life asking for a seat and being told the table was full. Now that she was being offered not just a seat, but the head of the table, the irony was sharp, because nothing about her had changed. Only the lens had shifted, but the applause came with its own shadow. Online forums and comment sections, once brimming with admiration, had started to split. A growing current of backlash found its footing in the usual places: anonymous threads, polarized blogs, and social media influencers eager to stir controversy. Some posts were blatantly racist, others veiled in the language of concern and objectivity. One popular fashion columnist questioned whether Amara's sudden rise was an example of inclusion over excellence, suggesting that her success was more about politics than talent. Another wrote a viral opinion piece titled, "When Identity Becomes a Campaign," arguing that the fashion world had overcorrected by turning people into statements instead of models. These criticisms weren't new in nature, but they hurt differently now. Before, rejection had been private, quietly delivered in email inboxes or brief, uncomfortable meetings. Now it was broadcast, debated, dissected. Every compliment came with an echo of doubt. Was this praise genuine, or was it penance from an industry scrambling to prove it had evolved? In the midst of it all, Amara received an invitation to appear on a popular daytime talk show known for tackling cultural debates with emotional weight. She considered declining. The idea of sitting on a plush couch under studio lights, reduced to sound bites and applause cues, made her uneasy. But Sierra encouraged her to go, not to defend herself, but to reclaim the narrative. On the day of the taping, the atmosphere backstage was tightly controlled. Producers briefed her on the questions, offered makeup services she politely declined, and reminded her to keep her answers personal but inspirational. As she stepped onto the stage, applause erupted, and the host greeted her with practiced warmth. "You've been called the face of a movement," the host began. "How does that feel?" Amara took a moment before answering. Her eyes scanned the audience, mostly women, some holding signs with her name, others watching with guarded curiosity. "I don't want to be a symbol," she said. "I never set out to represent anything other than my right to be seen as I am. This," she gestured vaguely, encompassing the campaign, the attention, the discourse, "is not about making a statement. It's about making space. I just want to exist with dignity." The studio fell into a hush. For a second, even the host looked unsure of how to respond. The line was unscripted, unpolished, and undeniably human. The segment aired the next morning, and that single quote, "I just want to exist with dignity," spread across media channels like wildfire. It became the headline, the tweet, the pull quote, and unexpectedly it resonated. People reposted it not just in the context of fashion, but in broader conversations about representation in film, education, even tech. Her words had landed somewhere deeper than aesthetic debates. Still, Amara kept a wary eye on the tides of public perception. Praise could be fickle, especially when tied to trend. Behind the flattery, there was always the risk of being reduced again, if not to too dark, then to too political, too loud, too much. But even amid the noise, new doors began to open. A month after the talk show aired, Amara's team received a message from one of the largest fashion houses in the world, a brand she had admired since childhood, one that had famously rejected her portfolio without response 2 years prior. The tone of the email was unusually humble. They expressed interest in featuring her as a lead in their upcoming international campaign, an initiative meant to redefine global beauty. Amara was quiet when she read it. There was no satisfaction in seeing the name of the brand now requesting her face on their billboards. Instead, there was an eerie stillness. She had imagined this moment before, countless times. But standing in it now, she felt something hollow in the gesture. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she flew back to Atlanta for a few days, craving the comfort of her roots. Her mother met her at the airport, arms wide, the same way she always had. Over dinner, Amara sat at the kitchen table she'd grown up around, the noise of the world replaced by the clinking of dishes and soft gospel music humming from a speaker nearby. "They're offering you what they never wanted to give," her mother said gently, after hearing about the campaign. "Question is, what do you need from them now?" Amara didn't answer immediately. She thought about what it meant to walk through a door that had only been opened after it became convenient to do so. Eventually, she decided to take the meeting, but not without terms. She returned to Los Angeles, drafted a clear response with her small team, and made one condition non-negotiable. If she were to accept, the campaign must also include 5 other dark-skinned black women from different parts of the world, each with their own story, their own beauty, their own lens. The brand took 2 days to reply. When they finally agreed, it wasn't with the enthusiasm she expected. It was measured, almost cautious. But they agreed, and that was enough. The campaign planning began almost immediately, and Amara found herself once again in the center of something that had started as a simple plea for visibility. Only now, she wasn't alone in the spotlight, and for the first time, she felt the weight of its shift, no longer just hers to carry, but something shared, something multiplied. She wasn't sure if the world had changed, but she knew one thing with certainty. She had. Amara's return to Atlanta felt like a homecoming, not just of geography, but her own battered spirit. Rolling out of the airport, she was greeted by the muggy August air that clung to her like an old friend. Her mother's arms were wide, and for once, being the center of attention felt safe rather than exposed. Friends and neighbors spoke to her what they'd seen in the billboards and on TV, but more importantly, they asked how she was, not as an icon or a symbol, but as Amara. In the days before the brand's campaign kicked into gear, Amara spent time reconnecting with her roots, with the contours of her story. She met with her childhood best friend, Tasha, over collard greens and cornbread at their favorite soul food spot, revisiting memories of teenage dreams and shared notebooks filled with fashion sketches. She walked slowly through her old neighborhood, hearing the soft of the cicadas and the distant laughter of children. It grounded her, reminded her why she begun in the first place. When the message arrived from the fashion house, their acceptance of her condition, it came in the quiet of her room late in the evening. She read it again and again. "We agree to feature you along with 5 other dark-skinned black women from diverse backgrounds," it said. Not discover you, not include you. It was framed as collaboration. That subtle shift in language gave her pause. She leaned back, letting the softness of her mother's old quilt cradle her shoulders, and breathed in the enormity of it. It wasn't justice, it was strategy. But strategy could shift markets, shift conversations. That evening, she texted Sierra, "I'm ready." Within days, she was back in Los Angeles, meeting with a creative director and brand team in a glass-wall conference room overlooking palm trees and traffic. The air smelled faintly of ozone and ambition. She sat across from the people who had once turned her into an afterthought. Now they addressed her carefully, as though her presence itself required explanation. They laid out their vision, a global print and digital campaign titled Shades of Us, accompanied by short films and behind-the-scenes content. They envisioned Amara as the face, but also promised to foreground the other 5 models equally. They talked of inspiring inclusivity, reshaping perceptions, leaning into authenticity. It all sounded earnest, even hopeful, but Amara listened with measured intent. At the end, she stood and spoke calmly. This campaign can be more than symbolism. It can claim space, not just for me, but for all of us who've been told we don't fit. Because of our color, our stories, our existence. We make this real by being visible in our fullness, not just foreground, but centered. Silence followed, then nods, then, eventually, agreement. The days that followed were a whirlwind of casting sessions. Sierra invited the other 5 women herself, each from a different continent: Lagos, Sao Paulo, Nairobi, Mumbai, and Kingston. Amara watched as they came into the studio one by one, some tentative, some poised, all bearing histories of dismissal. She greeted each of them with her own quiet warmth. "You're seen," she'd say, "and you're not alone." The shooting was collaborative, experimental. They photographed them singly, in small pairs, as a group, sometimes under stark light, sometimes under colorful filters. One moment, Amara stood beside a young model from Nairobi, their skin tones gleaming in contrast, their arms raised in mirrored joy. Another moment, she stood apart, watching them, absorbing their presence, feeling an unfamiliar fullness in the distance between them. Sierra whispered, "Look around. This is what it's supposed to feel like." Meanwhile, the brand began releasing teasers. Close-up shot of eyes, of lips, of hands. Rich shades of brown forming a mosaic. When the full campaign finally launched, it debuted not in luxury magazines first, but on digital billboards in overlaid urban neighborhoods, on subways, on transit stations in multiple countries. Then simultaneously in Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, on fashion websites globally. The tagline, "Too dark or too many shades amiss?" The response was immediate and multifaceted. There were praises, hundreds of posts celebrating representation, stories about what it meant to see oneself in a global campaign. Writers lauded it as a true turning point in how beauty is framed. At the same time, critics emerged, some questioning the authenticity, others accusing the brand of virtue signaling. But all of it was part of the moment's volume. The conversation demanded. In interviews for the campaign, Amara spoke softly, deliberately. "This isn't a trend," she reminded audiences. "It's history finally catching up to us." So many people will scroll past a face like mine and see something easy, pain, exclusion, something to admire from a distance. But we are not easy. We are not interruptions. We are expressions. That is what this campaign is. She spoke of the models beside her, urging people to see them, to know their names, their stories. She brought them into the narrative as equals, not extras. Back in Atlanta, Amara's announcement was met with emotion. A church youth choir performed a song for her. Her old community center held a panel discussion on colorism, where she shared the stage with local activists, educators, and young girls who had grown up looking like her. Her mother watched in the front row, tears in her eyes, hearing words spoken into a microphone. "She is our own," someone said, "and she has made space for us all." Amara stood from the podium, looking out across the room. Faces of pride, relief, gratitude, aspiration. It wasn't just her campaign on display. It was their presence. She realized then that the real change had begun the day she couldn't walk into an agency. And now she stood in boardrooms, in exhibitions, in billboards, and most importantly, in hearts. Her life was no longer about breaking in. It was about opening doors that had been bolted shut, about inviting others to walk through after her. That kind of power wasn't glamorous or easy. It was generative. It didn't mean the world had changed overnight, but something had. And it began with her and a refusal to stay silent. As the campaign unfolded across continents, Amara felt something shift inside her again. Not burden, but purpose. Not performance, but presence. She had become more than a face on a billboard. She had become a beacon for every person who had ever been told they were too much, too dark, too invisible. She didn't want to be an icon. She simply wanted them all to be seen.